Riders of the Pony Express, Ralph Moody. Chapter 1. To Save the Golden State. When gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill, the news had barely stirred a ripple in San Francisco, but April 3, 1860, was a day of wild excitement, joy, and celebration. A shouting crowd jammed Montgomery Street from gutter to gutter. Frightened horses bolted away, upsetting carriages and unseating riders. The people of San Francisco had reason to celebrate. Their fastest means of communication with the East had been letters carried by stagecoach on the Butterfield Overland mail route, and the trip took nearly a month. Now a rider mounted on a swift horse was ready to race away on the 1,966-mile run to St. Joseph, Missouri. With the first Pony Express mail, if, as promised, the run could be made in 10 days. Californians would for the first time be in close touch with news of the nation and their friends and relatives in the East, but the Pony Express had been established for a far greater reason than to furnish the Californians with convenience. The embers of civil war were smoldering, and slave-holding states were threatening to secede from the Union. Although California had been admitted to the Union as a free state, its loyalty was very doubtful. Many of its citizens and government officials were from the South and were determined to swing the Golden State to Confederacy. There was a great possibility of their success. Less than 500 miles separated California from the slave-holding state of Texas, but nearly 2,000 miles of wilderness and high mountains cut it off from the closest free state to the east. In addition, the Butterfield Overland mail route lay entirely through the South, where Union communications to California could be cut at any time. The President and supporters of the Union were deeply worried. In case of war, the loss of California, with its fabulous wealth, might be a staggering blow to the Union cause. If the state were to be saved, a faster and safer means of communication with loyal California Unionists must be established immediately. One of America's greatest strengths is her ability to produce men capable of meeting every national emergency. The man who rose to meet this one was William Russell. He was the senior partner of Russell, Majors, and Waddell, overland freighters between St. Joseph, Missouri, and Salt Lake City, Utah. He believed that by a central route, light riders on relays of fast horses could carry the mail between St. Joseph and San Francisco in 10 days. From St. Joseph, it could be speeded east by the newly built railroad. At first, everyone laughed at Mr. Russell's idea. Mountain men argued that the Rockies and Sierra Nevadas could never be successfully crossed in winter. Plainsmen argued that the Sioux and Piute Indians would kill any lone rider trying to cross their homelands. Mr. Russell still remained firm in his belief. He knew the western country thoroughly, and he knew the type of lightweight, hard-riding young horsemen it was producing. He was sure that 80 of the best among them, with 400 fast horses, could overcome every obstacle with speed. courage, and determination. To do the job, 80 well-supplied relay stations would have to be built along the most direct route, across the prairies and up the Platte and Sweetwater rivers to South Pass, through rugged Utah, around Great Salt Lake, across the Nevada deserts, and over the high Sierra Nevada mountains of California, to guard the stations from Indian attack, and to provide food and shelter for riders and horses. 200 keepers and stablemen would be needed. Mr. Russell knew the cost would be tremendous, but he offered to furnish the United States government semi-weekly, 10-day Pony Express mail service between St. Joseph and San Francisco for $500 a round trip. When in January 1860 Mr. Russell made his offer, the Senate was sharply divided between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces. Southern senators were determined that Northern communications with California should not be improved. They were successful in blocking passage of a bill to pay for carrying of Pony Express mail. When the Senate refused to pay for their services, Mr. Russell and his partners decided that they had an obligation to their country and would discharge it regardless of cost to themselves. They immediately set to work making careful plans for speeding and safeguarding the pony mail. They believed that both depended on the swiftness and endurance of relay ponies, since a single rider could not fight off Indian attacks and would have to escape them by running away. For this reason, a pony's load must be no more than 165 pounds. Only riders weighing 120 pounds or less would be hired. Equipment must weigh no more than 25 pounds, and each rider's mail load would be limited to 20 pounds. To reduce weight, protect the mail, and speed up relays, Mr. Russell had special Pony Express saddles and mochilas made. The saddle was only a light wooden frame with horn cantle stirrups and belly band. The mochila, pronounced mo-chila, or mantle, was an easily removable leather cover that fitted over the saddle with openings to let the horn and cantle stick through. At each corner of the mochila there was a cantina, or pouch for carrying mail. These were fitted with locks, and the keys would be kept only at Salt Lake City, San Francisco, and St. Joseph. Each mochila would be carried the full length of the line, being moved from pony to pony as relays were made. Since the rider would be sitting on it, it could not be lost or stolen while he was mounted. If he were to be thrown or killed during his run, the mochila would remain on the saddle and, no doubt, be carried on to the next relay station by the riderless pony. Mr. Russell knew every foot of the 1,966-mile Pony Express Trail and divided it carefully into relays for the ponies and routes for the riders. Where the going would not be too hard for a pony, relay stations were spaced 25 to 30 miles apart. Where the country was rugged, they were spaced nearer together. Each rider was given from 3 to 5 relays in his route. At both ends, he would have a home station where he would live between runs. Every trip made with the Pony Express mail would be a race against time. In addition, Mr. Russell made them races between the California and Mormon riders west of the Rockies and the Prairie Riders on the eastern side. Keen rivalry already existed, and he took full advantage of it in setting schedules and buying horses, doing his best to make the race an even one. For the rugged mountains and deserts west of the Rockies, he had tough mustangs bought and set the schedule at 165 miles a day. For the Prairie Riders, he had many fast race horses purchased and set the schedule at 220 miles a day. The Prairie Boys must ride considerably faster than the Westerners, but they would be following the Oregon Trail most of the way and would have no high mountains to cross. Of course, there could be no finish line, for the race would start at both ends of the route, but whichever team was first to reach Bear River on the Utah-Wyoming boundary would be the winner. With their plans made, the partners wasted no time. They announced that Pony Express mail service would start from both San Francisco and St. Joseph at 5 o'clock on the afternoon of April 3rd. Then they sent the best men in their employ out to build relay stations, purchase hay and grain, buy the finest horses that could be secured at any price, and to find young men who were worthy of carrying their country's mail. The West was full of rough, daring, and reckless gunmen who were afraid of nothing and could be hired for $30 a month. Russell, Majors, and Waddell would have none of them. They would pay their Pony Express riders $100 to $150 a month, but no man would be entrusted to carry the mail until he had signed this pledge. I do hereby swear before the great and living God that during my engagement and while I am an employee of Russell, Majors, and Waddell, I will under no circumstances use profane language, that I will drink no intoxicating liquors, that I will not quarrel or fight with any other employee of the firm, and that in every respect I will conduct myself honestly, be faithful to my duties, and so direct all my acts as to win the confidence of my employers. So help me God. As each rider was hired, he was given a lightweight rifle, a Colt revolver, a bright red flannel shirt, blue trousers, a horn, and a Bible. Each man was assigned to the part of the long trail that he knew best, and was given a few simple instructions. In spite of weather, lack of rest, or personal danger to himself, the mail must go through. Whenever a mochila was brought in, he must immediately carry it over his route at the fastest speed his mounts could endure. 2 minutes would be allowed for changing ponies at relay stops. To carry mail on schedule was his duty. To carry it safely was his trust. Whenever possible, he must avoid Indian fights, depending on his pony's speed to make an escape. The uniform might be worn or not, as the rider chose. If he wished, he might carry an extra revolver instead of a rifle. Although the task seemed impossible, everything was in readiness by the afternoon of April 3rd. Twilight was just falling in San Francisco when the Pony Express agent locked the first St. Joseph mail into the cantinas. As the crowd whistled and shrieked, Jim Randall tossed the mochila over his saddle, swung aboard, and raced away on a beautiful Palomino pony. Actually, Jim and the Palomino were no more than showpieces. Their run would be only to the wharf, where they would go aboard the steamer Antelope and ride quietly up the river to Sacramento. From there, the actual race was scheduled to start at midnight, and rough, tough Sam Hamilton would be the first real pony rider eastward. Chapter 2. Johnny Frey, the First Rider. In 1860, St. Joseph was a sprawling frontier town on the muddy banks of the Missouri River, and its send-off of the first Pony Express rider was even wilder than San Francisco's. A late train and a few nearby saloons helped the celebration along. By 5 o'clock on April 3rd, a big crowd of frontiersmen had gathered in front of the Pony Express office. But the mail train from the east was more than 2 hours late. The crowd was thirsty, and Jeff Thompson, the colorful and popular mayor, was full of oratory. With so long a wait, the frontiersmen quenched their thirst often, and with each drink their cheers grew louder. The mayor would not be outdone. As the noise of the crowd increased, he raised his voice to a bull-like bellow. After introducing Mr. Russell and his business partner, Mr. Majors, he talked on and on until the train came in, and he ended in a burst of flowery phrases and waving arms. The mail must go through, he shouted, hurled by flesh and blood across 2,000 miles of desolate space. Neither storms, fatigue, darkness, mountains or Indians, burning sand or snow must stop the precious bags. The mail must go. The mail did go, but less than half of the crowd knew who carried it. Just as the mail train pulled in, Bill Richardson, a hostler at the livery stable, rode up on the bay mare that was to make the first Pony Express run. By this time it was growing dark, torches had been lighted, and the crowd was in a wild uproar. A newspaper reporter, anxious to be the first out with the news, rushed back to his office and wrote the thrilling story of Bill's grand takeoff. But it was a young man named Johnny Frey who carried the first pony mail. Johnny was a farmer boy from Wathena, Kansas, a little fellow weighing barely 100 pounds, but every inch a horseman. His reputation as a race rider was known up and down the Missouri, and Johnny was a showman. His bright red flannel shirt and blue trousers were almost hidden by a silver-spangled jacket and bat-wing chaps. A pair of holstered six-shooters hung at his hips. His rifle and horn were slung across his back, and silver spurs jangled at the heels of his fancy Spanish boots. Sylph, the bay mare, was a beautiful Kentucky thoroughbred, and Johnny had her rigged up like a parade horse, with massive silver-studded saddle and bridle. She pawed the ground nervously, while Mr. Russell wrapped the packets of mail in waterproof silk and locked them into the 4 cantinas of the mochila. It was 7:15 when Mayor Thompson fired off a cannon, and the race for San Francisco was officially on. Johnny Frey had practiced well for this moment. As the crowd whistled, hooted, and cheered, he vaulted into his saddle without touching the stirrup, rearing to her full height. The mare burst through the noisy crowd and raced down Jewel Street toward the wharf. There the ferry boat waited to take them across the Missouri to the little town of Elwood on the Kansas side of the river. Showman that he was, Johnny Frey was first, last, and always a horseman. All the fancy trappings had been fine for the crowd in St. Joseph, but there was a race ahead, and a tough one. The minute he was on the ferry, he pulled the heavy trappings off the mare and cinched on the lightweight Pony Express saddle. Next, he shucked off his own fancy gear, including the rifle, and stowed it in a closet, where it would be handy for his return trip with the pony mail. On the trail, he would give his horse the lightest load possible: buckskin shirt, breeches, and moccasins, his horn, and a pair of revolvers stuck under his belt. The ferry had barely touched the Elwood landing when Johnny leaped the mare ashore and raced away into the darkening night. The Missouri Valley was then heavily wooded far to the westward, but Johnny Frey knew every trail through the timber as well as the deer and wolves that ran it. Leaving Elwood, he turned the mare onto a winding trail that bore off along a creek to the southwest. As soon as they entered the timber, the blackness closed in solidly. No man could have seen at arm's length, but horses can see in the dark much better than men. The mare threaded her way unerringly along the trail. From the feel of her body under him, Johnny read every twist and curve as well as if he could see. Where the branches were low, he lay close along the mare's neck. Then, on the straightaways, he urged her into the fastest pace. Because the start had been more than 2 hours late, there was a lot of time to be made up if the Eastern riders were to equal or better the schedule set by Mr. Russell, and Johnny Frey was determined to make up his share of it. He drove the mare hard for the first 10 miles, then ran a hand down along her neck, feeling for the heartbeat in the artery. It was strong and steady, no need to ease off yet. 3 miles out from Cold Springs Ranch, Johnny's first relay stop, the mare half stumbled, or did she falter? Quickly he slipped a hand beneath her flying mane, feeling for any nerve twitch that would tell of nearing exhaustion. He could feel none, but the mare was breathing hard now, and he knew her lungs must be burning. A little talking might take her mind off the pain. Stretched out along her neck, with his face close to her unseen ears, he began soft talking in rhythm with the beat of her hoofs. "That's my girl, Sylphie. That's my pet. We'll show them Californy boys. We'll learn 'em what kind a horsehair makes fiddle music." Carefully gauging the mare's remaining strength, Johnny held back just enough for a smart dash into the relay station. The keeper there had 3 beautiful daughters, and Johnny Frey liked to show off for pretty girls. When at last Johnny rode out of the woods, a speck of light from the station twinkled across the prairie. Reaching for the horn hung across his back, he blew 3 sharp blasts. the signal for the keeper to have a horse saddled and ready to go. A quarter-mile out, he called on the mare for her final sprint, with spurs just touching her flanks and mouth, close to her pinned-back ears. He whispered, "Now, girl, now leave 'em, hear the snare drum." Sylph responded like the thoroughbred she was, pouring out the last reserve of her strength. She quickened her pace until the sound of her hoofs rolled across the prairie like vibrant music, then sliding to a stop where the cheering keeper and his daughters waited, with the relay horse. She stood with heaving sides and head hung to the ground. The mare's hoofs were still sliding when Johnny leaped from the saddle, snatching up the mochila as he went on. With a slap on her shoulder, he called, "Good horse, Sylph," tossed the mochila over the saddle of the waiting pony, sprang aboard, and raced away. Westward from the Cold Springs Ranch, the prairies lay in rolling hills, with here and there a glimmer of light from some homesteader's soddy. There was no moon, but a few stars showed between the drifting clouds. Pushing the fresh pony as fast as he dared, Johnny headed out across the open prairies, swerving a little now and again to skirt a creek, bend, or steep hill. He held a course straight for Kinnicook, 44 miles out of St. Joseph, and his next relay point. Johnny's mount on that run was a strongly built Morgan, but it was winded and beginning to stagger when he brought it into Kinnicook. From there, the route was easier for the ponies, but not too safe for the rider. It followed the old military road, veering off to the northwest, across the Kickapoo Indian Reservation, then on to Seneca, Kansas, 80 miles out from St. Joseph, and the end of Johnny's route. Changing horses at Granada and Log Chain, Johnny Frey rode those last 36 miles in less than 2.75 hours. At 1:40 on the morning of April 4th, he galloped his spent and dripping horse into the cheering crowd at the Seneca home station. In almost pitch darkness, he had ridden 80 miles in 6 hours and 25 minutes, nearly 3 times faster than the California mail had ever been carried. At the other end of the line, Jim Randall and his beautiful Palomino pony were still riding peacefully up the Sacramento River on the steamer Antelope. Chapter 3. The First Rider Eastward. There was no wild celebration in Sacramento when, at 2:15 a.m. on April 4th, Sam Hamilton and Bolivar Roberts, Western Superintendent for Russell, Majors, and Waddell, stood in the darkness and rain, watching the steamer Antelope nose with annoying slowness toward its dock. For 2 days a steady drizzle had been falling. The streets were ankle-deep in mud, and riders splashing in from the foothills had reported a blizzard to be blowing in the high Sierra Nevada mountains. Bolivar Roberts was worried. The success or failure of the Pony Express might easily depend upon its first run. If the first mail were to be lost or fall far behind schedule, the whole venture might be ruined, and in deep mud no horse could run a 25-mile relay in the scheduled time. As soon as the rain began, he had sent word to have relay horses strung out at 5 to 8 mile intervals along the trail. Each was to be kept saddled, blanketed, exercised, and grain-fed. On the first report of a blizzard, Roberts had sent riders hurrying to the mountains with strings of pack mules. The mules were to be kept constantly on the move, treading out the trail through any canyons or passes where blowing snow was beginning to drift, even if it took the pony rider a week to reach the summit. The mules must keep the trail open until he had passed. Sam Hamilton, like the white Mustang he held by the bridle reins, was mountain-born and raised, and like the Mustang, he was not more than half-tamed. He wore buckskins, with the hair left on to shed the rain. No rifle was slung across his back, but a pair of Colt .45s were shoved under his belt. Sam's worry was because the Antelope was 2¼ hours late. He would carry the mail to Sportsman's Hall, 60 miles east of Sacramento, and high in the foothills. From there his friend Boston Upson had been chosen to make the rugged ride up and over the crest of the Sierras. With a blizzard blowing, Boston's chance of getting through with the mail was only 1 in 10, even in daylight. If night overtook him among the high peaks, his chance of living to get out was hardly 1 in 1,000. There was only one way for Sam to help his friend. He'd have to reach Sportsman's Hall by dawn, so that Boston could have every possible minute of daylight for his fight across the summit. Jim Randall had tasted glory in San Francisco and hoped for more at Sacramento. As the Antelope neared its pier, he mounted his Palomino, ready to ride triumphantly down the gangplank. Sam Hamilton would have none of it. "Get offen that nag," he shouted. "Get that mochila to the rail and heave it here." Grabbing the mochila in mid-air, Sam slapped it across his saddle and was on top of it before the rearing Mustang got its hoofs back to the ground. His spurs raked from shoulder to flank as his feet found the stirrups, and the white Mustang bolted away in a mud-splashing series of crow hops. With rain ends slashing, Sam raced up J Street, past the Capitol and Sutter's Fort, then eastward onto the Folsom Road. 7 miles out, there would be another Mustang waiting, and this jug-headed white was tougher than sun-dried hickory. 7 miles through deep mud at top speed might kill him, but horseflesh was cheap compared to a friend's life, and every minute saved would give Boston a better chance. Sam kept his spurs lashing and the line ends flailing for 6 miles. Then he felt the bronco beginning to weave in its stride. He'd have to ease up a bit. Better let the relay man at 7 Mile know he was coming. Pulling the horn over his shoulder, Sam blew 3 loud blasts. Panicked, the Mustang tried to bolt out from under the sound, caught its stride, and galloped into the relay post with its last ounce of strength. Hamilton wasted no time in telling the Mustang it was a good horse. In one fast flow of motion, he jumped off the exhausted bronco, with the mochila in his hands, flung it over the waiting pony's saddle, and leaped aboard. Without answering the good luck, shouted after him, he spurred away toward the next relay post. The run to Folsom lay across the flat valley floor. Here, if anywhere, time could be saved for Boston. There'd be no letting up on this Mustang. He'd taste spurs all the way to 15 Mile House. Sam's last horse into Folsom was a buckskin with a black line down its back and zebra stripes on shoulders and forearms. Hamilton knew the horse and had ridden it many a time. There'd be no need for spurs and line ends now. This little bronco, if allowed, would run at top speed until he dropped dead in his tracks. The buckskin was within a minute of dropping when Sam slid him to a stop at the way station in Folsom. That ride is one that will long stand in American horse history. On 3 half-wild Mustangs, Sam Hamilton had ridden 20 miles through rain, mud, and darkness in 59 minutes. Few riders or horses could do it on dry ground in daylight. From Folsom on there could be little hard galloping. The drizzle had become a steady rain. The night was pitch dark, and the 27-mile run to Placerville was up and down steep hills and hogbacks. In the blackness, Sam had to let his mounts follow the trail as best they could, but he drove them to the limit of their endurance. Riding at top speed by feel alone, he must sense each slip or stumble in time to pull up the pony's head, help it regain its balance, and try to save it from a fall. 3 times a horse went down before he could save it, but each time Sam jumped clear, and neither he nor the pony was badly injured. There was no dawn, but the blackness was thinning to murky gray as Sam spurred a mud-smeared Mustang up the last long hill to Placerville. From Placerville, the trail wound steeply up Hangtown Gulch, rising more than 2,000 feet in the 13-mile climb to Sportsman's Hall. As Sam spurred upward, the temperature fell, and the rain turned into fine sleet, whipped down from the high mountains by a northeast wind. Ice-covered tree limbs crowded the trail, and the rocks underfoot became as slick as wet glass. Riding at any faster pace than a walk was treacherous, but Sam drove savagely. It was now light enough to see the trail, and every minute of daylight was one that Boston might need to save his life. Midway to Sportsman's, a relay man waited with a fresh pony, a quarter-mile before reaching the spot. Sam's played-out Mustang slipped, went down, and was unable to rise. In leaping from the saddle, Sam fell heavily, ripping his cheek against a boulder. Up in a moment, he blew 4 sharp blasts on his horn, snatched the mochila from his saddle, and ran toward the relay post. Alerted by the blast, the relay man rode to meet him halfway, and within 3 minutes from the time his exhausted pony had fallen, Sam was driving ruthlessly up the trail. Sam Hamilton was no man to pet or soft-talk a horse, but when Sportsman's Hall loomed through the grayness, he gave his drooping pony a slap on the shoulder. "Get along, old Bronk," he said wearily. "Let's show 'em we ain't plumb wore down." Lifting to a faltering, weaving gallop, the mustang pounded heavily up the trail to the Sportsman's Hall home station. The time was 6:18. In 4 hours and 3 minutes of rain-swept darkness, Sam Hamilton had ridden 60 miles, changed ponies 8 times, and climbed nearly 4,000 feet up the Sierra Nevadas. Few words were spoken in the half-minute it took to swing the mochila over to Boston's saddle. He knew what Sam had been through, and why he had done it, but all he said was, "Rough trip, Sam." "'Twa'n't half bad," was the only answer. But as Boston's pony whirled and raced away, tough, untamed, Sam Hamilton called, "Vaya con Dios, Boston." Chapter 4. The Midwest Riders. When Sam Hamilton had spurred ruthlessly through the night, no thought of racing against the Eastern riders had entered his mind. His only concern had been for Boston's safety, but to the Midwestern riders the race against the Californians and Mormons was on in earnest. When Johnny Frey had galloped into Seneca and tossed the mochila to Jim Beatley, he had gained 2 hours on the schedule. Within half a minute, Jim was racing away to the west, determined to whittle off a couple of hours more. Jim Beatley was in his middle 30s, but light and small. He was a Virginian, quick-tempered and hard-riding, but an excellent horseman. His route lay west along the road that is now U.S. Highway 36. Then followed the Little Blue River, northwest to Rock Creek, near the present town of Fairbury, Nebraska. There was no moon, but the stars were bright, the road was good, and Jim had a fine Missouri race horse under him. He kept it at a swinging canter for the first 15 miles, then 5 miles short of Guittard's Ranch, his first relay post, the horse began to falter in its stride. Jim felt quickly for a telltale nerve twitch in its neck, listened for a rasp in the sound of its breathing. Both were there. The horse was out of training and soft. Another mile at that pace would break its wind and ruin it. Jim eased the horse to a walk, let it catch its wind, then went on at an easy lope. The mount waiting for Jim at Guittard's was a Kentucky thoroughbred. He knew the horse, had ridden her in a mile race at St. Joseph, and she had finished last. Already annoyed at the time lost by the softness of his first mount, Jim was furious at having drawn this worthless mare. In his anger he galloped her hard for the first half mile, then slowed her to a swinging lope. With 25 miles to go, there was no sense in running her to death before he was fairly started. She'd give out all too soon anyway. Maybe he could pick up a decent horse in Marysville if this one lasted that long. 2 miles passed, and 3 and 4, and the mare was still holding to that long, swinging, ground-covering lope. Jim ran a hand along her neck, listened for a rasp in her breathing. Everything seemed to be all right. The air whispered rhythmically through her nostrils. There was no nerve twitch, and her hide was hardly damp with sweat. "Well, I'll be dogged," Jim chuckled to himself. "No wonder this mare couldn't win a mile race. She's a distance runner, and a plumb good one, if I don't miss my guess." The mare was all that Jim had second-guessed her to be. There was no clattering of hoofs as she swung past the cheering crowd of early risers at Marysville. Her pace seemed slow, but its long striding flow outdistanced the barking dogs that raced at her heels. Mile after mile the slim bay mare held her pace, and stride by stride Jim Beatley's admiration for her grew. Her breathing was still steady, and even when the flicker of light from the Cottonwood relay station came into sight, Jim was so far ahead of schedule that he knew the relay man would not yet be expecting him. As a warning to have a horse saddled and ready, he blew a loud blast on his horn. Startled at the sound, the mare leaped forward and sprinted the last mile as if she were fresh from the stable. As Jim made a fast relay at Cottonwood, he shouted to the sleepy stableman, "Rub this mare down and cool her out slow. She's a plumb good one." Then he spurred away in the starlight for the long run to his home station at Rock Creek. Jim's third horse was strong and sturdy, but not fast. Although he drove hard, the sun was rising when he rode into the Rock Creek station and turned the mail over to Doc Brink. Within 10 seconds, Doc had thrown the mochila over his own saddle and leaped aboard. Wheeling his rearing horse, he leaned from the saddle and said cautiously, "Wear your iron and watch out for Dave McCannell's, Jim. He's drunk." Again, and looking for a fight. McCannell's was a notorious bully and a fastman with a gun, but Jim Beatley had no fear of him. "You leave me do the worryin' about Dave McCannell's," he told Doc. "You worry about gettin' that mail to 32 Mile. We're only 3 hours up on the schedule, and like as not, them boys west of the mountains are burnin' up the trail." Doc Brink was in his early 20s. Though small, he was tough and strong, but almost childish in his love for fine horses. His route was the shortest and easiest of any pony rider's, barely 45 miles. With daylight and a change of mounts halfway, he might have gained a full hour on the schedule. Instead, he lost a half hour by failing to drive either of his mounts nearly to the limit of its endurance. It was noon when he cantered up to the station at 32 Mile Creek and passed the mochila on to Melville Vaughn. Mel Vaughn, thin and wiry, was a hardened frontiersman at 20. All morning he had been watching the sky to the west, and he didn't like the looks of it. A storm was closing in. Every possible minute must be gained before it struck, or the race with the Californians and Mormons might be lost. Heavy rain would turn the adobe soil of Platte River Valley into soft mud, in which no horse could keep up to a 9-mile-an-hour schedule. Mel didn't like the looks of Doc Brink's mount, either. One glance was enough to tell him that the horse was far from spent, and that Doc had been babying it. Slapping the mochila over his saddle, he vaulted aboard with spurs raking. What he shouted back at Doc came close to breaking the pledge he had signed when he became a Pony Express rider. Mel's route was not an easy one. Leaving the headwaters of Sandy Creek, the trail struck northwest across a high, rolling divide near the present city of Hastings, Nebraska, then down to Fort Kearny in the Platte River Valley, with only one change of horses in 60 miles. Mel drove at the fastest pace he dared, but gained back only 20 minutes of time Doc had lost. It was twilight and beginning to rain when he galloped his winded pony into Fort Kearny.